This is an ice bomb that freezes water, and this is a robot that we can code to play the game all on its own. And these are 25 things only in the Education Edition. And hey, the YouTube Council bets me that you can't subscribe to this channel before I dig down to Bedrock. So, to prove them wrong, insta-mine that red sub button down below. It's free, and it helps out a ton. This here is a balloon, but what might shock you is just how powerful this thing is. And while we'll get into how you get the ingredients to craft one of these, there is a lot of possibility here, both as a decoration and a bit of a school prank. Because even though we can tie this entity to a wall or a fence to keep it grounded, it's when we tie it to a mob that it really starts to get silly. See, in the Education Edition, you can get these guys to lift right off the ground. But unfortunately, you can't attach these to monsters, so there goes the killing method. But if it means anything, you can still pick up an iron golem, so that's kind of funny in its own right. And if you have yourself a bow and arrow or a trident, you can even shoot down the balloons to pop them. Now, when you break glass with your fist, it's supposed to drop nothing. So why does this work? Well, that's because using chemicals, we were able to create hardened glass. And with this, it'll take longer to break than normal glass, but it'll drop itself when broken by any tool or hand. And folks, it isn't just us who has trouble breaking this glass, but the creepers have issues too. Since even though a regular glass block has a blast resistance of 0.3, when we use aluminum oxide and boron trioxide to make hardened glass, now it's got a blast resistance of 9, which just for perspective, makes that harder than any building block that isn't made out of obsidian. This here is an ice bomb, and while it sounds cool, its use is even cooler. Since with one of these, you're able to freeze water on impact. And since you can throw this like an egg projectile, you can even start to use this for your own kind of ice bomb parkour. Though, be careful when you try this, because it does have a cooldown like an ender pearl. And what's also interesting is that this is the only projectile that's capable of hitting an enderman. But the reason that it does is because there's no effect for getting hit by this. But it is worth mentioning that if you throw one of these while you're underwater, it'll collide with a water source block and encase you inside of ice, which might just offer you some ready-made protection while you're hiding away from a drowned. And the way that we start to get all these cool items is through the use of the new feature, Elements. Now, as soon as you go into creative mode in Education Edition, the first thing you're probably going to notice is that there's 118 new items taking up your screen. And unsurprisingly, that matches the 118 elements that are on the periodic table. Now, these can be placed like blocks, but they're broken instantly using any kind of tool. And while that's neat for building out your scale model of a chemistry class, these don't really do much by themselves, but rather, they're going to be very useful for making the new items and compounds that we're about to see. But first, we'll need to get the elements, and the way that we do that is through the element constructor. Now, this is a block that you can only get inside of creative mode, but once you spawn one in, you can use it to construct the different elements by adjusting the number of protons, electrons, and neutrons inside of the table. So for instance, if you were to turn these numbers up to 6 electrons, 6 protons, and 6 neutrons, that'll give you element number 6, which is carbon. And while you could keep playing around with these sliders to get the other 117, you can't use the element constructor to get the secret element question mark, question mark, question mark. Since in the game, this is actually considered as element 0, and rather, the way that you're going to have to get that is through the material reducer block. Now, similarly, you have to get this through creative mode, but once you do, you'll find it's a simpler way to get the different elements. Although it doesn't help you get all of them like the element constructor, but rather this reduces certain blocks into their element components. So let's say you put in iron ore. That'll give you 64 iron element, 12 silicon, and 24 oxygen. Since in real life, the ore is based off of iron that's encased in silicate rock. But if we put in redstone instead, then we get that secret element 0, and we also get uranium, which I guess means that redstone ore is radioactive. But after you've used these two tables to break down into your elements, now you can finally use them to start making up some of the compounds. And of course, to do that, we're going to need the compound creator, another one of the new blocks. With this, we open up the door to 30 different compounds that we can make, both new and natural. And while this visually looks like a 3x3 crafting table grid, what's different here is that the recipes are shapeless, so it doesn't matter what pattern you use. And this is also the rare instance where it matters how many items are in a stack when you're crafting. So for instance, if I want to make water, I can't just put in hydrogen and oxygen, but instead I need 2 hydrogen to my 1 oxygen. And there you go, H2O. And finally, after we've figured out the formulas needed to get our different compounds out of the table, we can move on to our 4th and final workstation that comes in the Education Edition, the lab table. Now, here's where we conduct the different experiments that are possible using the compounds and elements that we got from earlier. But to see if anything works out, you need to insert different ingredients in different amounts and then hit combine to see what you make. But the chances of you guessing it are pretty slim, since there's only 4 successful recipes to make, and all of the rest of them are going to be unsuccessful, and it might even catch the table on fire. But once you happen to finally get one of these 4 successful recipes, then you can start to get some really cool stuff. Now, we've already seen the ice bomb, which was possible, but how about the inverse of that, the heat block? After putting a mix of iron, water, salt, and charcoal into the lab table, we get this unique block, which when placed down, will melt snow layers and ice within 2 blocks of it, but it gives off no light itself. And funnily enough, the reason this is in the game at all is because it's a reference to the same elements that go inside of the hand warmers. Though, I don't think I want to put put any of these blocks inside of my pockets, just saying. If you were to put ammonia and phosphorus inside of the lab table, then you can get this new item called super fertilizer. And from the name, you can probably guess what it does. What we've got here is a special kind of bone meal. And the easiest way to visualize it is that this works like bone meal used to back in 2012. Because if you use the super fertilizer, it'll instantly bring trees and crops to maturity. So you don't have to worry about a random chance of jumping up a stage. And also, if you were to try this on a grass block, then it'll grow more flowers in a bigger area than regular bone meal, which makes bone meal seem pretty lame by comparison. But don't worry, this is about to make it completely useless. Since, thanks to bleach, we no longer need bone meal for white dye either. If you were to mix up these ingredients inside of a lab table, we get ourselves the new bleach item, which if you were to combine in a crafting table with dyed carpet, wool, banners, or beds, you'll notice that it reverts all of them back to white. And before you ask, no, you can't drink it. And maybe it's just the internet that ruined me, but I was kind of surprised that you couldn't. Or, if you'd like, you don't even need to use elements to craft at all. And instead, we could take after this user and build them in our world for these giant signs. Now granted, you're kind of limited to the colors that they are, but from afar, it definitely is eye-catching. And if you ask me, it starts to make your world look like the Breaking Bad intro credits, which it's up to you if that's a good or bad thing. Or if you don't even want to place these inside your world, you could just put them in a chest to write out messages that way, since unlike regular blocks, these sprites are actually flat when they're inside of your inventory. Every classroom's gonna have its own rules, and that's where the allow and deny blocks come in. Now, as you can guess by the name, these are blocks that you can set up as an educator to place specific areas where players can or cannot build. Think of it like selective spawn protection, and that way a teacher could set up a plot for their class to build, all without getting the classroom griefed. I think that's a fair trade-off. And on top of modifying the building permissions, there's also a way to modify other permissions using the new /ability command. With this, an admin can give players certain permissions just to that player. Whether that's the world builder permission so they can build wherever they want, or you can give them the ability to fly with the may fly command. And finally, you can give them the ability to mute another player, which might be helpful if someone's talking during a lesson. And with the way these work, these abilities end up being similar to game rules, except they'll only apply to one player instead of the entire server. Though even if you do get the ability to fly from your teacher, that's not going to help you out with these border blocks, since these blocks are capable of preventing a player from leaving or entering a specific area. And unlike the barrier blocks in Java, these have a range of influence that extends both up and down infinitely, so you can't just dig under them. But it is worth noting that even though you can't dig through or under these, if you have yourself an ender pearl or a chorus fruit, you can still teleport through them. Just don't get suspended if you try that, okay? On top of using our elements to craft, we can also use them to brew in a brewing stand. And that gives us these new items of medicine. Now, these are almost like anti-potions. They're capable of curing effects instead of giving them. And we got 4 different kinds to choose from. We've got an antidote that cures poison, an elixir that cures weakness, eye drops that'll cure your blindness, and then a tonic that'll cure your nausea. And to get all of those, you'll need to brew a different ingredient with an awkward potion. And luckily, to make sure you don't waste it, you can only drink the medicine if you have that corresponding effect. Though it does beg the question that you could get rid of all of these if you just drink milk. This is a sign, and this is the chalkboard. Or rather, chalkboards, since we have 3 different sizes to choose from. We've got the 1x1 slate, the 2x1 poster, and the 3x2 board. And what's interesting about all of these is that they let us put more text on a board instead of a regular sign. And if you have the largest size, you can type up to 15 lines of text on the same board, which is definitely helpful for giving instructions. But besides that, they work like regular signs. You can walk through them, water or lava doesn't destroy them, the whole 9 yards. What you'll notice is that in the Education Edition, we've got 2 different kinds of torches. And the first one to talk about is these new colorful torches, which you get by adding these different metal chlorides into the torch crafting recipe, letting us get a blue, green, red, and purple variant. But unfortunately, they don't give off any kind of colorful light source, which I think is a shame, considering that is possible with the RTX features in Bedrock Edition. And speaking of colorful light, we've definitely got to talk about the glow stick next. Here, by using polyethylene, luminol, and dye, we can make our very own handheld glow stick. And we've got all 16 colors of dye to choose from. And while you can use these in your hand to light up as you expect, it doesn't actually function as a light source, but instead just particle effects. And after a while, its durability decreases and it burns out, which is a shame, but if you're looking for fun with particle effects, then the sparkler definitely has ya. Now, this is one of the rare items that you can put in your offhand in Bedrock Edition. And by mixing together chloride, magnesium, and a stick, we can get 5 different colors of sparklers to choose from, including an orange variant, which we didn't have with colorful torches. And when you use one of these in your hand, it emits particles like you expect, and it also glows. Just make sure you don't go into water while you're using it, because if you do, it'll just go out immediately. And instead, if you want light underwater, we've got to talk about our second variant, the new underwater torch. Now, this is something that we obviously can't do in vanilla, and the whole reason it's possible is because we add magnesium to a torch's recipe. And with this, we get a new silver and blue variant of the torch, and that's capable of lighting up as much blocks underwater as a torch does above ground, which might be handy for when you're looking for a place to explode the new underwater TNT. Now, the way that we get this blue block is that we add the sodium element with a TNT crafting recipe. And then, once we do, we're able to ignite this TNT underwater, much like we can above ground. And the reason this is because pure sodium has a reactive element with water, to say the least. But even if you don't have Education Edition, don't sweat it. This is actually possible in vanilla. You just put a sand block above a regular TNT, and it explodes just the same. This here is the camera. And what's unique about it is that it works as both an entity and an item in your inventory. And talking about the latter first, if you use it inside of your inventory, you can take a first-person screenshot as you expect. But when you place it on the ground, then it'll become an entity and start to take photos from the camera's perspective. And it even tracks the player while you're walking around for the perfect shot. And I know, it does look intimidating, considering that it plays the same detonation animation as the TNT, but don't worry, it's completely safe. And once it gets the perfect shot, you can look inside your new portfolio item and see the different photos that it takes, which, considering Bedrock doesn't have a screenshot functionality, I guess is the best we got. Now, from afar, these look like villagers, but up close, you can quickly realize that these are the new NPC mobs. And yeah, they're literally called NPCs. And here, we have the ability to customize these new characters in some pretty neat ways, such as giving them a custom name, choosing their appearance out of 20 different skins, and we can even let them create these dialogue boxes by using attached commands. And luckily for us, and for the NPCs, they're invincible, so they're not going to take any damage from any mobs or players that decide to get a little rowdy. And honestly, this is a feature that map makers in Java would kill for. And for that matter, they look a lot better than armor stands, so I hope we get them in the base game too. Now, this might look like a tiny iron golem, but don't get it twisted. This here is the new agent mob, which is a special entity meant to teach players how to code. Because if you use the new implemented code builder tool, you can actually give it different sets of commands of what to do. So for example, we coded in this loop of text so that it now builds a bunch of these rings inside of the world. And you can even have it break and place blocks since it has its own 27 item inventory. And while you can see by this list that there's so much that this can do, unfortunately, it can't interact with levers or buttons. So it's still not a replacement for the copper golem, which honestly just feels like a slap in the face for Mojang. But with how many other things you can use to code from this, I guess that makes up for it. And with that, folks, YouTube thinks that you might like this video, so see if they're right and have a good one, alright?